Mm, All right. Hi there, Epidemics. Looks like we're getting a little bit of a late start coming back from spring break, but it is time to get started. So I did post some assignments over spring break that are due Friday, this Friday, March 24th. And then I will be posting this week's assignments, the quiz and the journal entry on Friday, March 24th. And that will be due on Friday, March 31st before midnight. In addition, it's time to really ramp up thinking about the project. A lot of you guys have already requested your topic and told me how you intend to present the material you've learned. If you haven't done that yet, the requests for topic and method of the project are due on Sunday, this coming Sunday, March 26th, and the project itself is due on Sunday, April 30th. So we've got a little more than a month to get those finished. Okay, so we are moving on to the Black Death. So the Black Death, the information that we have that we're going to be discussing largely concerns what happened in Europe and what's called the Near East or the Middle East. So up in this part of the world, there's Europe and this part of the world. What was going on in China and India at the time, we know a little bit about it, but we don't have great evidence of what exactly was going on. We do know that later waves of the plague after the Black Death, they hit China and India pretty hard, kind of like the Black Death hit Europe. So we think that there was limited exposure in these areas during the part that we call the Black Death. What happened in Africa? Oh, it's so hard to find information on what was going on in Africa during this time period. There were civilizations, certainly. They probably left documentations of various kinds, but colonialism, they really did a number on any kind of evidence we could be looking at nowadays to try and find out what happened there. Yes, I know. Okay. So the term the Black Death was not used during the events of the Black Death. During the events of the Black Death, it was called the pestilence, the great mortality, or the year of annihilation. All of these grand terms. And it killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people in Europe and the Middle East. That's a pretty broad range. But we estimate that that was at the time in Europe, 50 to 60% of Europe's population. The Black Death lasted from 1347 to 1351. So 5 years. In 5 years, the population of Europe dropped by half. It took 200 years for the population to get back up to the levels it was in 1346. So the population went down. It took a long time to rebuild the population. We think we're kind of extrapolating from this, knowing that the Black Death did not hit North and South America, knowing that the Black Death might not have been as severe in China and India. We estimate that it was probably 25% of the world's population that died during this 5-year period. You'll find lots of different values. Different people have calculated this different ways. This is kind of a middle of the line estimate here. During the Black Death, the case fatality rate, the number of people who got infected and died from it, so looking at the percentage of infected people who died, was around 50%. Now, the Black Death was caused by plague, and plague is a specific disease caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. Oop. Sorry about that. Forgot to turn my volume off. So this was a specific bacteria. It still exists. People still get the plague today, but the modern case fatality rate of Yersinia pestis is around 11%. So even today, it's pretty deadly. 11% of people who get the plague die from the plague. We think that the Black Death was one of several different pandemics of Yersinia pestis. This map looks at the spread of Yersinia pestis during the period that we think of as the Black Death. So we know that it started showing up in this part of the Near East. So this is the Mediterranean Ocean here. Spain, France, England. This is Africa. This is Saudi Arabia. This is Turkey. This is the Black Sea here. So we know it was coming down to the Black Sea starting in 1346, 1347. That was the beginning of the Black Death. It then spread further west, starting around the Mediterranean. That's where it spread to next. And then it spread into England. It spread into other parts of Europe. The last areas to experience it were parts of Poland up here, and some of the former Soviet republics through this part of the world. There have been at least 4 confirmed pandemics of the plague. Same disease, at least 4 of them. It's a little tricky the way they are named, though, because the earliest one was called the Neolithic decline. And that was only discovered in the relative recent past. So the Neolithic decline occurred around 3000 before the Common Era, or 5000 years ago. It's not well discussed. We don't have written history from this time period that it talks about what was going on, but we have found plague DNA in the remains of people from this time period, and we have found what get called plague pits. So the plague kills so many people that we get massive mass burials. So we get huge pits dug and lots of people all buried in the same location. They're very characteristic of plague pandemics. So we do find those with the Neolithic decline. And we think that this pandemic really got started because this was the early days of agriculture. We started having reliable food sources. We didn't have to travel to follow food supplies, which allows for permanent settlements, allows for specialized skills. And we started getting communities of 10 to 20,000 people. Nowadays, that sounds like a little tiny town, but at the time period, those were considered mega settlements. Those were kind of the biggest size that existed. And they became common in Europe. I'm going to read this quote. Mega settlements of 10 to 20,000 inhabitants were becoming common in Europe, which made job specialization, new technology, and trade possible. But they also may have been the breeding ground for plague. These mega settlements were the largest settlements in Europe at that time, 10 times bigger than anything else. They had people, animals, and stored food close together, and likely very poor sanitation. That's the textbook example of what you need to evolve new pathogens. These mega settlements were abandoned in a relatively short time period. And we know that during this time, the population of England, specifically England, declined by 90%. So we think they were really hard hit from the plague during this time period. We're also going to talk a little bit about the plague of Justinian. This took place around the Mediterranean, and that started in the year 541 or 542 and continued into the 750s. This was what is called the first plague pandemic, and there were multiple waves of small epidemics and outbreaks. The Black Death, which is the biggest epidemic, biggest pandemic, as far as we know in human history. That is the beginning of the second plague pandemic. So it began in the 1340s, but it continued with multiple later waves of epidemics or outbreaks through 1743. And the third plague pandemic started in 1855 and continued until the 1960s. So you can see there wasn't a big gap between the second plague pandemic and the beginning of the third plague pandemic. Okay. So this is the image that I was supposed to be talking about with the Neolithic decline. So let's talk about the plague of Justinian. This took place and it affected what is called the Byzantine Empire. So this was the Roman Empire was starting to fall apart. And the Byzantine was the Eastern Roman Empire. And again, this had a massive death toll, even though it was probably a little more localized, but it lasted 2 centuries. You think COVID's lasting a long time? 2 centuries of plague. And the death toll was probably 20% of the world's population. Over that 2-century time period. Estimated deaths of 25 to 30 million. So again, this one was not a global pandemic. It was largely localized to the Middle East, but even so, it killed huge numbers of people. The population of the Mediterranean era was so high that it impacted the entire planet's population. We'll talk a little bit about the third plague pandemic towards the end of this discussion. So remember, that was 1855. The death toll was around 10 million people. At this time, the population was around 1.2 billion. So that was only about 0.8% of the world population. So the third plague pandemic was not nearly as deadly as the Neolithic decline, the Justinian or first plague pandemic, or the second plague pandemic. So that's kind of the overview of plague. We're going to focus most of our discussion on the Black Death, specifically that roughly 5-year time period. So we'll start out talking about what was life like in Europe and the Near East before the Black Death. So the information I'm going to give you, I'm generalizing it, but some of the information that I'm going to be giving you will be important for or specific for one part of Europe. So I might be able to find mortality rates for England, but not for Turkey. You know, so I might be able to talk about what life was like in France, but not in around the Black Sea area. So at this time period, medical care existed. There were doctors, but they generally only worked for the wealthy. So the lower classes, like today, had limited or no availability to health care. We did not understand germ theory. There were some ideas about diseases being transmissible from one person to another, but those were still kind of limited. At this time period, what we call the Islamic world, the Near East and the Middle East, they had much more advanced science during this time period than Europe did. We call this time period in Europe the Middle Ages. You'll sometimes hear them called the Dark Ages. Historians do not like that term. The implication is that times were hard. There was, you know, really bad quality sanitation, not a lot of advances, not a lot of art. That's really not the case. So we're going to try and stick to the term Middle Ages. Even so, during this time period, the major scientific and artistic advances were taking place in the Islamic world. The life expectancy during this time period for males was 31 years. Now, have I defined life expectancy for you guys?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, you did.
Okay, good. So you understand that this is not the expected lifespan for males during this time period, but just for males that reach about the age of 18. I'm sorry, it's for all males. Males that reach the age of 18 you were likely to live into the 50 to 60 year range, and some even into the 80s. It was a little bit higher for people in the Islamic world. So in the Islamic world, it was more like 60 to 80. So a little bit longer. Childhood mortality during this time period in Europe, 30 to 50% of children died before reaching 18. Nowadays, in the US, that is 3.1%. In other wealthy countries, it's around 2%. Okay. Most of the population were illiterate, unable to read, or only able to read a little bit. The wealthy, however, had access to books. It is not true that medieval people did not keep themselves clean, but baths were hard to heat, so they were not frequently taking baths in the wintertime. Not to mention, water had to be hauled by hand. It didn't come into houses in pipes, or in most places during this time period. A lot of places would have a bathhouse, which maintained hot water, and you were able to pay to bathe. So once again, the wealthy could stay cleaner and take more baths than the impoverished. But most people would wash their hands and their faces every day, washing their hands both before and after meals. There were outhouses, so it wasn't the type of toilet that we have today, but there were specific places to use the bathroom. So they weren't just squatting on the streets, except for, the occasional drunk, and we still see that, right? Okay, so life was not as easy as it is now, but it wasn't horrible. And we had this event called the medieval warm period. Which is on the picture, and I just typed it out again. So this was between around 950 and 1250. So it's a little hard to see on here. Each one of these individual lines is a separate reconstruction of temperatures in Europe from the oldest one goes back to the year 0 through the year 2016. The medieval warm period only occurred in Europe. This was not a worldwide phenomenon. But what it did was it increased crop production. Agriculture was easier. There weren't as many late frosts or early freezes. Winters were not nearly as harsh, and the population was able to expand and grow. Starting in 1250, the medieval warm period kind of came to an end. So if you look at that time period, that's 3 centuries where the weather was warm and the population grew. So when it started getting chillier again, that was quite shocking for the people in Europe. And we see what's often called the Little Ice Age. Again, this is in Europe. So starting in about 1250, crops began to decline. They weren't producing as much food as they were during the medieval warm period. We start seeing diseases. Rinderpest showed up during this time period. Rinderpest was a disease of livestock, and it has had mortality up to 100%. So if rinderpest showed up, you could lose all of your livestock, all of them gone. We have eradicated rinderpest from the world. It is one of the diseases, one of the two diseases that we have completely eliminated. The population was high, but the crops were barely enough to feed people. And a crop failure in 1 year could lead to large numbers of death through starvation. And in fact, 1315 to 1317, there was the Great Famine. This killed 500,000 people in England. Just so you know, the world population at this time was around 392 million. By 1400, the population was 390 million. So you can get an idea of, in 100 years, instead of the population expanding, it had declined by 2 million. There was lots and lots of malnutrition. The best food went to the wealthy and the ruling class and to the men. This was a time period when women were not treated very well. Women throughout history have had periods where they're treated incredibly badly, and then periods where they're treated well. So we go back and forth in society. This was a bad one. Malnutrition in mothers. So a lot of the women would be malnourished because they wouldn't get as much food, they wouldn't get the best foods. And this leads to decreased immune function in the offspring. And that lasts for the life of that offspring. So people were more likely to die of infectious diseases. There were pockets of severe poverty among the people who survived after failed crops. John Kelly, who wrote a book called The Great Mortality on the Black Death, said that Europe at this time was like a man standing up to his neck in water. Drowning is not inevitable, but the slightest rise in water could kill him. And into these harsher conditions rode the plague. Okay, yes, that's a cute little gerbil there. You probably already know that rodents are the reservoir species for the plague, and that it's transmitted from rodents to people by fleas. But if you don't, here we go. Now, some scholars are revising ideas of when exactly the second plague pandemic began, and some of the particulars about its origin. I'm going with the best information I was able to accumulate. This might end up being updated in the next 5 to 10 years, or it may have already been updated in the scientific literature. I don't have, not the scientific literature, the professional history literature, but I don't have access to those. So I'm doing the best I can. All right. Now we're going to go to Asia in 1330. Less than a little more than 15 years before the Black Death began. Cities in Asia had broad streets, they had fire brigades, they had freshwater canals, they had hospitals, bustling cities, lots of exchange between Asia and the Mediterranean, and in fact, specifically Italians. A lot of Italians would be living in neighborhoods in Asia, either for part of their lives or as immigrants. During the 1330s, we started having ecological changes. We think that there were some earthquakes, possibly some volcanic activity that led to this ecological change. So we see periods of alternating floods and droughts, followed by locusts. So we've heard of plagues of locusts, or you probably have. A plague of locusts is an outbreak. It's a specific type of grasshopper that has an actually really interesting life cycle. I'm going to just give you the simple parts of it. The simple parts are that certain conditions trigger these animals to form large swarms that travel together. And when they travel in these large swarms, they can wipe out the crops in a certain area. Locusts still exist. They still cause massive crop failures when they have these swarm years. I know there has been one in the past few years in parts of Africa, in the what's called the Horn of Africa, in the northwest corner of Africa. So we know that around 5 million people in Asia died due to these ecological disasters. Not so much from the plague, but due to floods and droughts and locusts and earthquakes and all of these kinds of natural disasters. We also know that in India at this time, there were major severe monsoons. So we have records of rains of, quote, frogs, serpents, lizards, and scorpions. Did that mean they were actually falling from the sky? Probably not, although tornadoes can pick up and drop small animals, or if they're severe, they can drop cows. Don't want to be under a cow when it's dropped by a tornado. But as a result of all of these ecological disasters in various parts of Asia, we have movement of rodents. Just like people are going to flee floods, they're going to flee droughts looking for better sources of food, so are the rodents. And rodents are the reservoir species for plague. That means that rodents can be infected by plague. It circulates naturally in their populations without killing large numbers of them. So we call these kinds of diseases that persist in animal populations in zootic, which means it is endemic or constantly occurring in animals and can be passed to people. So enzootic is a very specific term. Now, different kinds of rodents have different susceptibilities. Rodents are diverse. Remember, half of all mammal species are rodents. So what might cause disease in gerbils might not cause disease in squirrels, for example. So some survive, many of them survive with very few symptoms. Some of them, like the prairie dogs in the US, are vulnerable to plague and can have high mortality rates. So as the grasslands either flooded or dried out from droughts, they couldn't support rodent populations, so they spread out. Remember, it's actually the rodent fleas that act as a vector to transmit plague from rodents to people. Rats specifically do very well around human settlements and do not, well, they can reproduce in high enough numbers that even though they do die from the plague, the population doesn't tend to fall down dramatically. You don't see a big decline in population. And rats and their fleas can also be carried in trade goods. So traveling from Asia back to the Mediterranean area, the cargo can carry the rodents and their fleas. So again, we're talking that decade before the Black Death really got started. We had the Mongol Empire. So here's the Mediterranean, the upper corner of Africa, Saudi Arabia, India, Asia. This is kind of China here, but part of China, what's now China, is through here. This is the land of the Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire stretched from the Sea of Japan, which is right here, up to Siberia. Siberia is here, almost all the way to the Mediterranean. This is the Black Sea. This is the Mediterranean. And parts of what is now Eastern Europe. This is important because the Mongol Empire connected what we call the Eastern world, Asia, and the Western world. They had massive trade routes going from parts of Asia into the Middle East. And they were, they strongly enforced something called the Pax Mongolica, or the Peace of the Mongol Empire. So the trade routes were well protected. You didn't have a risk of running into bandits, or not a big risk of running into bandits. Travel was relatively safe. And they also created the YAM. The YAM was a postal service, similar to the Pony Express in the early Americas. Horseback riders would carry letters and information throughout the empire. Unfortunately, the Mongol Empire started to decline in the early 1300s. So you can kind of see what's going on here. We've got massive environmental catastrophes going on. We've got good trade routes that are not necessarily being as well protected. The Mongol Empire is failing in Asia. When we have a government failure, we tend to start seeing more traveling, largely through refugees. People going, okay, we've got a lot of violence going on here because the government's failing. We need to be somewhere else. So it is believed that the Black Death started in either China or Mongolia. So here's China, Mongolia is right through here, and was carried along some of these great trade routes. We don't know a lot about the plague in Asia. We do know that it occurred in Russia, which is up here, and in India here in about 1346. We know that there were outbreaks in Asia and in what is now Kazakhstan in the late 1338, 1339 time period. So we have evidence of major breakouts throughout Asia and throughout Europe. So these are all marked with red dots and dates. The best information we have is from the Mediterranean area. So even though the Mongol Empire was having a lot of upheaval and starting to fail, we do know that they were trying to expand into what is now Europe. So they were having a lot of problem back in Asia, so they were trying to expand east. And here's our Black Sea, here's our Mediterranean Sea. There's a city here called Kaffa, spelled C-A-F-F-A, sometimes K-A-F-F-A. It's a wealthy city, or it was a wealthy city, on this little peninsula, which is the Crimean Peninsula. Kaffa was established as a city-state, so a city that independently or somewhat independently ruled itself, established by people from Genoa, and Genoa is in what is now Italy. And it was an important trade port. You can see two major trade routes from the east traveled to Kaffa and then across the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. So that was one of the major ways goods got to the Mediterranean. It had a very highly diverse population for the time period. But during the siege, of Kaffa, the plague arrived. And it started killing the Mongol army. So the Mongol army was outside the walled city of Kaffa. And the Mongol army started to die. The Genoese were like, God has come to save us. God is slaughtering our enemies. The Mongols already knew about plague, and they knew that it could be spread by contact with dead bodies. And they reportedly catapulted dead bodies into the city. This is the first written evidence of biological warfare. So I'm going to send you guys into breakout groups, and I want you to think about and discuss this biological warfare. Do you think that, I mean, the plague did end up in Kaffa, but was it the dead bodies that brought it? Could it have been transported into the city some other way? What are the ethical considerations for biological warfare? I think we'll all pretty much agree that it's something we shouldn't be doing, but I'll let you guys have a conversation. So I have to go here And then, where are my breakout rooms? I'm going to put you in 2 breakout groups, and I'm going to give you 5 minutes to talk about this. start the countdown to close all the rooms. You have about a minute to wrap everything up. Okay, it looks like group 2 was having a lively conversation there. Any thoughts? Anything you want to discuss?
I'll say something.
Okay.
My group, we found that like, I don't know how they would even like load the bodies into the catapult without even like catching the disease of their own. Like, cause like that, they'd have to touch the body somehow too, right? And like, they
Yep.
probably didn't have any protective gear to like shield themselves from it. So I don't understand how they wouldn't catch it. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Anything else? Do you think that catapulting bodies was an effective way to spread the plague?
Oh, absolutely.
Do you think the plague would have gotten into Kaffa without catapulting bodies?
Most likely anyways.
Yeah, remember, rodents can get through tiny little spaces. They don't need a lot of crevices to get into a city. They can climb walls, they can swim to some degree.
Right. Also, like, wait, like the trading routes, I feel like there's just a bunch of like, they're just connected. Like, there's a lot of trading routes. So, I mean, they could have snuck in on like a cart of goods or something like that too.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, good. All right, so we've got our plague in the city of Kaffa now. And the Italians, the Genoese, started fleeing. The Mongol army was, making it hard for them to do trade, to get food, all that jazz. So they loaded up into boats. Here's my pointer. Moved across the Black Sea, across this little spit of land into the Mediterranean and back to Italy. These ships would sail along the shoreline, so they weren't, they were right here going along, stopping here in Greece and stopping in Sicily and in various cities in Italy, Constantinople, Marseille, and they were carrying the plague from one port to the next, spreading it throughout the Mediterranean. Okay, nasty pictures here. So we're going to work on the biology of the plague. So we already know the common conditions. We've already talked about the common conditions that trigger epidemics. People moving around. For the Black Death, we see them in trade routes, traveling, as well as fleeing the disruption of the Mongol Empire breaking apart. We see malnutrition. Remember, in England and in parts of Europe, there was a lot of malnutrition because the population had gotten too large, and when the climate changed, the crops could not support the population. Overcrowded conditions. The more people in a small space, the easier it is for diseases to spread. And when we talk about new epidemics, exposure to wildlife is a big one. New diseases tend to come from other animals. And so that can be destruction of natural areas, to make new housing, to make new farm fields. What we have going on today is a classic example of destruction of natural areas that have the potential to lead to another pandemic. In order for wild animals to survive, they have to be able to live near people. There's not a lot of wild spaces out there, so they just don't have that option. We also have an exotic pet trade, which can lead to disease transmission. We have the so-called bushmeat trade. Bushmeat is kind of a derogatory term for hunting. So it means non-domestic animals that are used for food. In the US, deer, elk, ducks, turkey, all of those. In parts of Asia, bats. You may have heard that they have found evidence of what appears to be COVID DNA in a species called the raccoon dog, which looks kind of like a dog with a raccoon coat on it, same kind of facial markings and everything. So, you know, this is how these start. Most epidemics affect the young, the poor, the very young, I should say, so under age 5, the poor, the elderly, and people who are frail for other reasons, that have other kinds of diseases. Plague, however, like the 1918 flu, tends to strike people in the prime of life. It tends to hit young adults. So we end up losing mothers and fathers and leaving children orphaned, leaving families without a breadwinner. If the father dies, can mom support the kids on her own? If mom dies, can dad take care of the kids and support them on his own? It's always hard to be a single parent, no matter what time period you're living in. These images are images of what the plague looks like. So these are relatively modern cases. These swellings here, this is the bubonic plague. These are the buboes that give bubonic plague its name. This black color here and this extreme purple color here, this is tissue dying. This is why it was called the Black Death, at least after the fact, because it causes a lot of tissue death. So let's go through the 3 major forms of the plague, because the plague causes different symptoms depending on how you were exposed to it. So if you were bitten by fleas, this is the bubonic form of the plague. This causes those swellings in the tissue. It causes tissue death. It has a case fatality rate, untreated, ranging from 30 to 90%. Even treated, it's still over 10%. Pneumonic plague, this is deadly, very deadly. And it's when a person with the plague exhales plague particles, or plague particles coming off of clothing or blankets are inhaled. So it initially goes into the lungs. That's pneumonic. Very fatal. The third form is septicemic, which can occur after or as part of the bubonic plague. And this is when it gets into the bloodstream. So the plague either starts as bubonic and then gets into the bloodstream, or it enters through breaks in the skin. And it's pretty deadly that way too. So we're going to talk about these different kinds. And we're going to start with pneumonic. Pneumonic was pretty common during the time period known as the Black Death. So this is one of the more deadly strains. So this is one of the reasons the Black Death was so deadly. It started with fever, respiratory symptoms, coughing up blood, headaches, and then in about 3 to 7 days, pneumonia. Pneumonia is a specific kind of lung infection. We talked about this during the 1918 flu pandemic. And you get a buildup of fluids and dead cells, and you end up having the air passageways in the lungs get clogged. You get inflammation, and you're not able to get enough oxygen. Usually untreated, within 2 to 3 days of pneumonia, it's fatal. Now, you can catch the pneumonic plague from rodents. You can catch it from dogs or cats who go outdoors in areas where plague is endemic. Endemic means that it's naturally occurring. Remember, in zootic, endemic, was somebody say something? Nope. Okay. Endemic is just, it's naturally occurring in the native rodents. Some species or some strains are more likely to either spread this way or evolve into pneumonic. So it can spread from person to person and by inhalation, but it can also spread from fleas, but then the bacteria end up in the lungs and you end up with pneumonic instead. Highly contagious. It can be aerosolized, which means it can be exhaled. It looks like the flu at the beginning. And by the time you realize it's not the flu, it might very well be too late to do anything about it. The CDC calls this a Tier 1 or Category A disease, which means that it's one of the most dangerous diseases out there. There's a lot of concern about using this strain of plague in bioterrorism. Because if somebody starts spreading this strain of plague, even with treatment, it has a high fatality rate and it spreads very easily. So it is something to be concerned about. Septicemic plague, septicemia, is a life-threatening infection of the blood. And it can be caused by plagues, but it can be caused by other diseases as well. Any kind of septicemia, any cause septicemia is very dangerous and going to have a high mortality. Septicemic plague is transmitted by the bite of fleas, just like bubonic. It's kind of disgusting. You get bleeding under the skin and from mucous membranes, which means the inside of the mouth bleeds, the inside of the nose bleeds, the inside of the rectum bleeds. You have extremely high temperatures, so on the order of 103 to 105. Fevers that high in adults can be fatal just by themselves. You get chills, vomiting, and there will be blood in the vomit. There will be gangrene in extremities. You can go into shock and have organ failure. So this is not something you want to experience. Fortunately, untreated, fortunately, this sounds, you're like, what do you mean fortunately? Untreated people tend to die within 24 hours of symptom onset. So it's fast. We have treatment that works for this. And for septicemic plague, the mortality rate is down to between 4 and 15%. So we can do a lot for this. The bleeding under the skin, I showed you some dead tissues in a previous slide. This purple tissue here, that is bleeding under the skin. The black spots are dead tissue. So this can be caused by both bubonic and septicemic plague. These purple spots were called tokens of God's anger. It was a sign that God was mad at you and he was punishing you for something. The way this works, what's going on in the body, the bacteria that the strains that get into the bloodstream and cause septicemia release something called an endotoxin. Toxin is right there in the word. It's toxic. And that causes disseminated means all over the body. Intra means inside. Vascular, that's blood vessels. Coagulation. So that means clots in blood vessels all around the body. Obviously, this is a very bad thing. Clots in blood vessels can cut off blood supply to various parts of the body, which can cause tissue death. They can, if they're in the heart, that can be a cause of heart attack. If they get in the brain, that can be cause of stroke. So lots of different problems with this disseminated intravascular coagulation. It causes perfusion of blood vessels. Perfusion of the blood vessels means that they start leaking. The blood starts coming out of the blood vessels and into the tissues. And what's called ischemic necrosis. Necrosis, anytime you see N-E-C-R, necro, we're talking about dead tissues. Ischemic is related to blood vessels. So you have a blockage in the blood vessel, which causes the tissues to die. So that's what's going on that causes all of this abnormal bleeding and purple spots under the skin and dead tissues. The last form of the plague is the bubonic. This is the most common form. We saw a lot of pneumonic during the Black Death, more than we normally see. But as a general rule, the bubonic is the commonest form. And I'm going to just give you a description. I'm going to read a description from a Franciscan monk named Michael from the city of Piazza in Italy, describing what happens. The burn blisters appeared and boils developed in different parts of the body, on the sexual organs, in others on the thighs or on the arms, and in others on the neck. At first, these were the size of a hazelnut, and the patient was seized by violent shivering fits, which soon rendered him so weak that he could no longer stand upright, but was forced to lie on his bed, consumed by a violent fever and overcome by great tribulation. Soon the boils grew to the size of a walnut, then to that of a hen's egg or a goose's egg, and they were exceedingly painful and irritated the body, causing it to vomit blood by vitiating the juices. The blood rose from the affected lungs to the throat, producing a putrefying and ultimately decomposing effect on the whole body. The sickness lasted 3 days, and on the 4th, at the latest, the patient succumbed. So he was describing bubonic plague that transitioned into pneumonic plague. So these start as a black or dark colored blister surrounded by red pock marks. So little red, almost pimply looking things. There would be a high fever, headache, nausea, vomiting, thirst. The bacteria would move into lymph nodes. So lymph nodes, you know what? It's going to take me a little bit more time to describe lymph nodes to you guys. So we're going to stop here and we're going to come back and talk about the symptoms of bubonic death. We're going to talk about why the plague can be so deadly. We're going to talk about the transmission. We're going to talk about what it does to rats. We're going to talk about how we can treat it in modern times. Any questions on anything we went over today?
Yeah, I think.
Okay. In that case, I will see you guys on Thursday. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Have a
Bye.
great one.
Thank you. You too.
Hi.
Hi, Eric.
Hi. You said we could meet after class if that worked
Yes.
today.
Hang on a second. Let me make sure I'm stopping the recording.